It's been a long time since I last saw a Disney movie that played my heart like a drum as if I was fighting for my life. I remember watching Peter Pan for the first time, jumping excitedly around the living room and feeling a tightness in my chest when Hook was about to go for the final kill. The real-life adaptation was such a sure net for Disney, grabbing attention and excitement throughout the seven seas. But I guess I wasn't a fish worth catching. Released in 1953, the movie became an instant classic that enchanted not only me, but countless childhoods throughout the world. Like many others, I was curious how Disney would transform the story into a live-action remake, and because I'm a huge fan of the original story, I thought maybe I should watch it. How bad can it be? Well, at least it was a unique experience I never expected. And that made me think, what did the classic better to capture the audience? In that regard, this video is not necessarily a review, but rather a comparison of two works that find their origin in the book Peter Pan by James Matthew. The beginning of a movie can also be called the golden minute, a time frame that the audience gives each film before deciding if it's worth continuing. Of course, this period varies from person to person, and the studio you already trust is likely to receive more time because you know it will be worth in the end. But right now, when attention spans are low, the first impression is all the more important. As the title of the video says, we will only explore the prologue of both pieces. This is not because I never finished the live-action version. Perhaps not everyone who came here is familiar with the movies, even though I personally recommend the classic. So let me give you a quick summary. Both openings have roughly the same length of 8.5 minutes when we ignore the composition in the beginning. The classic starts slow, with a narrator's voice gently introducing us to the Darling family. Father and mother dress up and prepare for an important dinner. Panicked, the father rummages through drawers in search of his golden cufflinks. Meanwhile, the boys are playing in the room above. They vigorously fight with swords and hooked hands, wrapped in a cloud of fantasy. It takes a few minutes, but eventually, the father bursts through the door, still searching his buttons. Some mishaps occur which lead to the father dragging Nana out of the children's room and announcing that Wendy should grow up and move to a different room. The opening ends with Wendy wanting to remain a child to avoid spending her last night in the children's room, while her father and mother head off to an important dinner. The remake of 2023 is hardly any different in this regard. Instead of narrator's voice and a beautiful town, we follow the children's development through a series of images until we finally observe Wendy going upstairs. Her parents tell her to pack the suitcase as she will move to a boarding school, which she doesn't find amusing at all. After a few arguments and a sword fight with her brother, Wendy is told to take the path to adulthood, just as her mother did before. Interestingly, the scene describes a similar dynamic, as long as you don't look too closely. But it quickly becomes clear that even though they both sprout from the same roots, they grew into entirely different movies. And that's when I became suspicious, because Wendy was no longer the loving big sister I knew, but a young, perhaps belligerent, angry girl. Growing up is a problem everyone gets confronted with at some point. However, the time when your new phase of life begins is different for everyone. Because of that, Wendy was a character lots of people could identify with. But sadly, both characters couldn't have been written differently. Most people probably remember a loving sister who tells stories to her little brothers and thus enjoys their respect, trust and love. Trust especially is a cornerstone of a healthy relationship in our world, and Wendy's charm and caring nature make her an instant favorite. It becomes even more devastating when her brothers realize the father forces Wendy to leave the children's room. It becomes clear that she must learn to take responsibility in the movie, something she initially resists. Wendy too, on the other hand, well, I'm not sure how to describe it. I basically understand where they wanted to push her, but they made a fatal mistake. Wendy too is the exact opposite of her former role model. Love and trust have been replaced with loneliness and envy for her brothers who can still walk carefree in the world, something that has been taken away from her. Wendy too is unhappy about her current situation and doesn't want to move to a boarding school, which portrays her in a more realistic light. Her bitchy behavior and challenge to authority towards the family are some of the traits that could be associated with her, but also her duel against her middle sibling, where they unintentionally break the mirror and she tries to blame it on her brother. This characterizing moment stands out, so most people unfortunately see and remember her as a kind of bad person. But not to get off topic, I can only explain this decision because Disney wants a strong woman in the movie, even though strength can be characterized by more qualities than just brute force. If I remember correctly, it was never impressive and heroic to destroy little brothers in a sword fight and then avoid any responsibility. In fact, it's the opposite. If you are already dueling with your little siblings, isn't it much more heroic to let them win and be the big villain they must overcome? At least that's what I used to do with my little sister when we created our own RPG stories outside in the garden. Interestingly, the classic did just that. The big brother loses to the smaller one. The Dark Souls method of moving from boss to boss is actually relatively easy to pull off in New Garden, and it's also quite fun to play the evil antagonist and lose on purpose. If we talk about the siblings, the brothers always bring out a childish side in me. Jumping across the bed with swords and having adventures can become one of the most memorable moments as a child. I used to go out practically every weekend to replay Clone Wars with my friends. The movie conveyed that urge to explore very well. They jumped from bed to bed, banging their wooden swords around their ears as if they were Tom and Jerry themselves. The fight is exciting and even tells a little story that glimpses into the future. Nevertheless, the fight also takes the time to show how much of a role model Wendy is to them. So now I should normally say something about the brothers burdened by the remake, but surprisingly, there's hardly anything. They are there obviously, but when Wendy isn't hitting them with a stick, you can usually only see them blurred in the background. Just look at the sword fight. Is it realistic? I mean, maybe yes, but no child has ever imagined a fight like this, and I would know that. I've played Clone Wars in the garden. It seems dull and unimaginative. The fight is just there and has no narrative flow itself. Little things like Wendy noticing that the hook is on the wrong hand, or dialogue that makes it clear that Captain Hook hates Peter Pan, are woefully absent. The warmth, strength, and sense of adventure the boys possessed vanished. Each character and plot is unfortunately a free spinning gear wheel. It almost seems to me that the director has forgotten that all the elements should interact with each other. A machine needs to harmonize, or else it grinds itself to death.
You really must set a better example for your brothers. They look up to you so much.
What reason do they have to even take Wendy as a role model when she just obliterated them minutes ago? Interestingly, the mother was a surprise. She doesn't necessarily differ from the version in the classic, but she has charisma that the classic can't match. In an atmosphere that seems depressing and demeaning rather than warm, friendly, and adventurous, Miss Darling is like a bright star in the sky, given motherly care. This makes her the only positive source we can even cling to. However, there are still two characters from the classic that we need to talk about. Who guessed it? The father and the dog, Nana. After all, it's the father who supports Wendy as a character. He thinks she should finally grow up, which even puts Wendy in a position to think about her future in the first place. What does it mean to be an adult? What will I do in the future? Will I become as stubborn as Mr. Darling? Does being an adult mean losing all your inner child? The answer to that is just unclear, and Wendy is suddenly confronted with something she never had to ask herself. The father's stressed out demeanor sometimes make him seem like an antagonist, and in a rather dark setting, he could be the reason why Wendy suddenly disappears at night to find her happiness. An approach the real-life adaptation could have taken, but the creator of the classic managed to ease the tension by using Looney Tunes effects, and yet they haven't forgotten to give him his important moment so he can express his thoughts about the situation. When he was talking to Nana outside, the older viewers could understand that he was worried about his children. He just looks at the world through a realistic lens and therefore cannot understand the fantasy world his children live in. He lost his inner child a long time ago. With her humanization, Nana is exactly what the father cannot believe to exist. He sees her as nothing more than a dog, although she is so much more than that and is rightly called a nanny by the children. Because, like a grown-up person, she looks after them and cares for them, brings them medicine or what whatever that is, and obviously she also cleans up the room. She's like a fantasy figure with whom the children explore the unknown world. So it becomes even sadder that father and Nana could have been cut out of the new adaptation. It's quite difficult to implement Nana's role in the real life adaptation. I understand that. A dog doesn't have the same expression as his animation counterpart. So the question arises, why put those characters in the movie at all if they play no role and are nothing more than an object on a tally sheet? Nana just plods along and the father is rightly annoyed by the children's behavior. There's one word they lack, empathy, except for the mother. No one is likable or pleasant enough to really want to know more about. Before we take a look at the music and the set design, there's one more person we can talk about who hasn't appeared in the movie before. I'm talking about Peter Pan himself. The question you should probably be asking yourself is, how can I talk about this character at all? Well, even if Peter Pan's first appearance still has to come, he was mentioned often enough to arouse curiosity. The narrator tells us for the first time about a mysterious person who only visits families that believe in him. Miss Darling thinks he is an angel who watches over her children, and the boys see them more as a freedom fighter who mercilessly crushes villains. Wendy is the first person to confirm that Peter Pan exists, because she locked his shadow in a drawer for protection after Nana stole it. In the meantime, the father makes jokes about how silly his wife is. For him, fantasy can no longer exist. You can't make the future more obvious. What will happen after the children are asleep? Obviously, Peter Pan will break into the room through the open window to get his shadow back. The writers of the live-action adaptation would be idiots if they left it out. Why exactly does Peter Pan come to his house? Yes, they believe he exists. At least that's what I think. Unfortunately, it wasn't made clear in the live-action adaptation. You only find out from Peter Pan that he already set his eyes on Wendy and was only waiting for her to express. You can only find out from Peter Pan that he had already set his eyes on Wendy and was only waiting for her to express the wish to remain a child. Well, did you recognize where that sound came from? It's a real goosebump moment when you hear it out of nowhere. Like effects, sound and music can emphasize the impact of a scene and make it unforgettable. The overpowering evil presence that Vader radiates can even be heard through his breath alone. You notice him before he appears on the screen. Every single step brings terror with it, louder and louder until he stands in front of you. Of course, you can't expect to introduce music in the first 5 to 10 minutes that will linger in our minds for years. However, filmmakers can exploit the potential to enhance certain actions or moments. Cheerful and wild sounds are used when the boys jump around, and timpani beats escort the swords. Similarly, the music can become darker when the father breaks into the children's reality, or softer and sadder when Nana is dragged into the doghouse, where the father reveals his true feelings. The music itself is always part of the immersion. However, I did notice one little thing that won't matter to most people, but still can make a difference. It would probably be easiest to show you.
Sorry, John.
Oh, you'll never leave this ship alive!
Oh, yes, I will. Take that.
Scuttle me bones, boy, I'll slit your gizzard!
Not forgetting about me, are you? Michael, give me your treasure. Now leave Hook to me. Make way, Captain, lest I run you through!
Both soundtracks are beautifully, but the new one seems more like an assembly line product. Not that it bothers me, but the music in the classic has this handcraft touch. It's more than just a beautiful melody. It almost feels like it's trying to tell the story itself. In the live-action version, the atmosphere is gloomy, sometimes even suffocating. We often see how dissatisfied Wendy is with the situation and how she rebels, be it in the rolling of her eyes, the look in the night sky, or her mother's conversation. I know that Peter Pan will come to visit, but it could just as easily be that Wendy runs away from home at night and meets Peter Pan out on the streets chasing his shadow. However, she also could have moved to the boarding school and had an adventure like Mia and me once did with her journey into a fantasy book.
Is it just a dream or some fantasy or maybe just
I'm not saying that it's good to know what happens, but the movie should at least have an idea of the direction it wants to take. With Star Wars, some plans had to be brought to Ben Kenobi before the movie took a new direction. Matrix gives us two enemy organizations that we as viewers want to explore. And Harry Potter shows us magic, charming and emotional characters, and a boy who is supposed to live with his aunt and uncle who hate him. We can't help but worry about him because he will probably be abused. A good filmmaker knows to give reasons we subconsciously grasp without necessarily thinking about. If something seems illogical or inclusive, it's noticeable. That's why you often find questions on the internet that usually start with the word, "Why doesn't character ABC do this?" New consumers are often more forgiving of internal logical errors than longtime fans. This is partially because they are unfamiliar with the medium. After all, they usually have no expectations. And while we are on the subject of expectation, let's look at them as well, shall we? People watching the real-life adaptation for the first time have no idea what kind of movie they are getting into. From the start, the movie looks like nothing special. The dark and hectic atmosphere leads the viewer to believe that they are watching a movie with serious and difficult themes, which in the end have their consequence and perhaps even end in tragedy. Things that don't necessarily have a place in a children's movie. Of course, children should be confronted with sad or difficult topics. In my opinion, a good children's movie also appeals to adults. Snow White, The Lion King, and Beauty and the Beast are perfect examples of this and deal with serious social issues. The main character always radiates a certain emotion, like love or dreams, that captivate and almost draw you in. But they also talk about death and show how it affects people and their surroundings. If you already know the classic, then you will approach the movie with expectation, if you want it or not. Every movie makes a promise that it has to fulfill. Viewers will take the promise of a fairy tale-like story from the classic and always transfer it to the remake. Even though the movie shows a familiar scenery, the characters all feel alienated. This wouldn't be a problem if the movie tried to establish its own identity, but as we've already seen, this doesn't happen. So fans of the original only see an inferior and disappointing imitation, which is nevertheless praised by critics. Or not. It's easy to say you didn't like the movie. It's harder to form a critical opinion to determine what you didn't like and advise other groups whether it's worth watching. I personally would not recommend this film, and I'm aware that I didn't finish it, but I also don't need to. The first 10 minutes are enough to show that all the magic which made the original movie a classic is lost. The video would normally be over now, but I don't want to send you away with a negative taste. I love to think about what the writers could have done differently and often lie in bed reimagining movies when I should be asleep. Of course, this whole process is subjective and the things I want to see may be entirely different from people watching this video. Still, I would like to try my hand at the remake without compromising Disney's vision. After all, it would be easy to say they should have done it like the classic. For the record, there are a few things I would revise. Wendy as a modern strong woman, the irrelevant boys, Nana speaks for herself, the absent father and the depressing atmosphere. Let's start at the beginning. I don't understand why the writers left out the father-mother scene. It literally tears a hole in the world introduced to the viewer. After all, the prologue takes place in the family house, but the parents still react to the outside world because Mr. and Mrs. Darling prepare to go to an important dinner. At the same time, it removes the immersion that we are actually seeing a lively family home somewhere in a big city. Young children in particular are quickly tempered and sometimes hard to control. If you combine that with the stressed father, you get a natural bomb that will explode on its own at some point. Especially children find the father's clumsiness strange and funny, but they don't realize why the father acts the way he does. It adds depth to the scene that only a grown-up audience can perceive. Later, the same thing can be seen with Peter Pan, who laughs at a crocodile chasing Hook, not knowing that it will hunt him one day as well, when he's grown up. I would therefore leave the scene as they are and only add little things that the live-action adaptation wanted to address. Firstly, the narrator's voice is needed to give us an omnipotent insight into the house at the beginning, before we can fully immerse ourselves in the story. At the same time, both parents have been invited to a dinner on whom the father's job depends. Secondly, Wendy still has to pack her bags, otherwise her father would be late for work the next day. But let's not get too emotional here, or it will conflict with the pace of the fight between the siblings. So we switch to Wendy. Although I have to say I'm undecided, I like the idea of giving her a stronger role at the beginning to at least bring some change to her character, but I also think it goes against her personality when she picks up the sword. It hurts the caring and loving figure who took care of the boys and has to find her own way between the two extremes of Hook as a bitter adult and Peter as a carefree child. So by making her a fighter who lives for her own selfish fantasies in the real-life adaptation and doesn't think about her consequences, she becomes unsuitable for the role of the nurturing mother that Peter chooses her for. My idea therefore would be to have Wendy play the villain Hook, so that the boys fight against her, but it has to stand out that she is still the caring sister. Not only would this have given Wendy a stronger modern female role that uses her superiority to help the boys grow on her, but it would also allow the family love between the three to develop. Wendy would come across as a more mature role model, but she would still certainly retain her childlike side. She lets the boys participate in her fantasy world and is prepared to play the villain so that they can celebrate their fantasy in a glorious victory. So when they romp through the room, we could try to merge animation with reality. Some of the beds become ships. In their epic fantasy they knock over objects, including a suitcase. Dialogues like, "Wasn't it enough to rich you with my treasures, you little brats also took my hand," replace meaningless questions like,
Mother, why does Captain Hook hate Peter Pan?
That's a very good question.
"No, I've stolen the fairy dust," as she rattles a small bird cage on her belt. The boys should keep the adventurous character who jump around the room wildly, chasing Wendy but not yet understanding enough of the world to create their own stories. Nana could be part of the fantasy world as a drawn creature, always clearing away objects, just like Roger Rabbit once did.
Drink the drink.
But I don't want the drink.
He doesn't want the drink. He does.
I don't.
You do.
I don't.
You do.
I don't.
You do.
I don't.
You don't.
I do.
You don't.
I do.
You don't.
Listen, when I say I do, that means I do.
Wendy, as Hook, is defeated and falls to the floor while the siblings take the cage off her hip and celebrate. Frustrated, the father storms into the room, searching his cufflinks and last white shirt, knocking over toys in the process. Walls of blocks collapse that only a short time ago looked like mighty castles. So while the father wanders around the room, Wendy tries to calm her youngest brother, who is still jumping around the room excitedly with a toy bird cage in his hand. Eventually, she gets them both to help tidy the room, and just as the middle brother has a pile of blocks in his arms, the father finds the shirt. Now could also be the opportunity to bring the mother into the room because, as in the classic, the white fabric has been painted with chalk and transformed into a map leading to the treasure. Mother comes in and the two children confess that they have drawn the map that Wendy described to them yesterday. "I'm sorry, father, I had no idea there would draw you on your shirt." "Punishment is necessary," replies the father angrily. Then he sees the knocked over suitcase during the romp and assumes Wendy doesn't take her responsibilities seriously. Wendy is an adult. She must finally learn to take care of the important things in life. From tonight on, she sleeps in a different room. The mother intervenes and diverts the father's attention, telling him to get a new shirt quickly because time is running out. On the way out, the father steps on a trolley and falls to the ground. He's out of his mind and takes Nana out of the room so that the children learn to keep the room clean. Now the bomb exploded and slowed down the film, causing the father down in the garden to finally show his true feelings and laugh, just like it was done in the original. Meanwhile, the children slip into bed. They are all sad that Wendy has to go to boarding school. The little one in particular might be shocked and doesn't want Wendy to leave him as he clings to his mother's dress. Mom explains a few reasons why Dad is in such a bad mood and that he just had a stressful day. She gets the cufflinks from the little boy, but Wendy doesn't want to grow up and go just yet. Finally, they address the shadow before the father and mother leave the house. With everything I've said now, I still dislike the idea of Wendy picking up the sword. But I think combining a masculine side with the female side of raising someone so that they learn to overcome the challenging things in life is the right approach. After all, there's a difference if she fights her brothers for fun or to demonstrate superiority. I'm looking forward to your opinions and discussions in the comments, but I still have one question. What is it that you would like to see from Disney again? If I could only wish for one thing, it would be that they make movies that immerse children in a fantasy world once more. Stories like Peter Pan are special and important because they follow kids throughout their lives, and even if they don't understand everything yet, the acts of grief, loss, friendship, fantasy and love influence them throughout their lives. Even adults can learn from the movie and get an insight into the fantasy world of their kids. As long as a children's movie is only for children, it is not a movie that teaches them anything valuable. Adults shouldn't be afraid that children have magical friends with whom they explore the world, because they are all on a journey through mysteries until they find themselves on the shores of adulthood. And on this journey, we should accompany them.